Not long after Playmates lost the Star Trek license, Art Asylum and then Diamond Select Toys stepped in to pick it up, and for the best part of the next decade, they pretty much were the only company producing mass-market Star Trek figures. During this time, they produced figures from virtually all of the Star Trek series except for Voyager, and probably the most comprehensive of all these lines was Star Trek the Original Series. But sadly, that line was never completed. As is demonstrated in this photo, there were plans to produce another wave of figures with a few more characters we hadn't seen before. That sadly never came to pass. From this point, Diamond Select started to experiment with deluxe figures and diorama figures, and releases would become sporadic at best over the next few years. But a couple of years ago, MacFarlane Toys stepped up to the mark and acquired the Star Trek license, with a promise of producing a brand new range of 7-inch Star Trek figures from all eras. The first wave hit the ground running with two very strong character candidates, Captain Kirk and Captain Picard, and the second wave promised to include Spock and Michael Burnham. But sadly, that was never to be, as the Kirk and the Picard were the only figures released in this line. So today, I'm going to take a look back at these two figures to see how they measure up. First off, the packaging is of course employing the standard Star Trek branding that we've seen on all products that are Star Trek related at the moment, which is fine. It's quite colourful, but a little bit bland, a little bit lacking in detail and interest, I think. But mercifully, the packaging is quite small and relatively compact, so it's easy to store. The reverse of the packaging is identical for both figures, and of course it displays both of them with their accessories on the back. It also advertises future releases, so we can see that role-playing phaser there, but also crucially we can see Burnham and Spock, although perhaps tellingly they are just artist renditions and not actual photos of figures or prototypes. So here's Kirk out of the packaging, and I have to say the overall impression is quite striking, that this is a really nice looking figure. It's nicely sculpted and he holds himself really well. The gold tunic is very colourful and it's very nicely presented without being too much. The figure of course is made of a hard plastic, but it is nicely textured. You'll notice there's a slight grain to the outfit. And I think the moulding is very nicely done, particularly in the torso. It looks in proportion and it's nicely sculpted, and this definitely feels like a cut above from previous releases. Also, his insignia is a separate sculpted piece that has been stuck on, so it has that extra texture there, it has that raised quality, which is a very nice touch, and allows it to stand out. The boots are very authentic, they're very nicely sculpted, and I particularly like how effective the boot cut of the trousers is, where it just folds and creases there just perfectly. Now the head sculpt is really interesting. I think they've really nailed the hairline and it looks really effective. The way they've got those sort of waves in the hair and the lines running through it looks perfect. But there's something about the face that I'm not quite sold on. I do think this is a very strong likeness if we compare it to William Shatner, and yet somehow it's also ever so slightly off. I'm not quite sure what it is because I do feel like they've nailed the eyes, but I think maybe the shape of the face is a little bit slightly elongated. I don't know, I can't put my finger on it because I do think this is a really fantastic sculpt. I think it's a really detailed one, and yet somehow it's just ever so slightly off for me. Now the articulation is interesting. MacFarlane aren't really known for having fantastic articulation, although they have stepped up their game in recent years. He does have a ball jointed head, so he can spin it from side to side, and he can look up and down ever so slightly, but not a lot really. He does have ball jointed shoulders, but look what happens when you push it out there. That it doesn't work well with the mould of the tunic there. It looks really off and strange if the arms aren't just close to his side. But they do reach out a good distance. He does have that elbow with the swivel and also the hinge, so he can bend his arm 90 degrees, which is good. He's got a swivel wrist, and it does bend from side to side as well, or hinges up and down I should say, so that's pretty good. Now I'm pretty sure he does have a swivel at the waist, but mine doesn't want to turn, so I don't know whether that means there isn't one or it's just being difficult. He does have those hinge hips, which can be a bit unsightly when you press them out too far, but they do kick forwards a good distance, which is great, and they even go back a little bit as well, which is pretty decent. Now he's got the same joint in the knee as he has in the elbow, so that means it can swivel from side to side, and of course it hinges at 90 degrees there. Now sadly there is no articulation at the boot, which would have been a nice swivel there perhaps, but sadly not. He does have pivoted feet though, so that means they can swivel from side to side, and of course they're hinged to go up and down as well. He does come with quite a few accessories as well. He has a spare hand to hold his phaser, so of course he has a phaser as well, a communicator, and the Where No Man's Gone Before assault rifle. And I do want to quickly talk about the assault rifle because, wow, it's actually articulated, so that central column there spins round, which is a really neat touch. And I think the paint apps on this thing are absolutely gorgeous. I love there's so much colour on this, and there's so much little details. Each of the buttons are painted accurately. Yeah, fantastic. In terms of how he holds his accessories, well, the one thing I can confidently say, there's no danger that any of these props are going to fall out of his hands because the grip is insanely tight. One of the things that's quite neat is you'll notice each of the fingers individual there, so you can slide the communicator into place and he holds it really tightly. It's maybe not quite that accurate, but it's a good look. Likewise, he holds the phaser and that phaser grip hand perfectly. I mean, this just looks spot on. And in terms of the assault rifle, so long as he's got it in this position where it's sort of aimed down, it looks great, that looks fantastic. It gets a little bit more tricky if you want him aiming upwards or even at chest level, because then him being able to hold it just doesn't quite marry up without there's being a compromise in the articulation. It looks a bit strange. And for anyone who's curious to see how he measures up against the Articulation version, here you go. They both stand at more or less the same height, and here you can really start to see some of the key differences. This MacFarlane version obviously looks a lot more detailed, whereas the Articulation looks a lot more basic and toyetic, I suppose. Okay, I'm moving on to the Picard. Straight away you can see, obviously, this is a completely different mould to the Captain Kirk, so there is some distinction going on between them, which I think is really nice. They definitely feel unique, and the colour is a lot more muted on this figure. Now, I'm honestly not sure how I feel about this sculpt in terms of the torso. You can see there is an attempt to give it more detail, so I quite like that there's those two lines there, but they feel a little bit too ingrained, that it probably isn't very authentic. Again, I really do like that the pips have been moulded in, likewise the communicator badge there, all moulded in there and painted separately, so I think that's a really cool touch. And once more, the feet, the shoes there are completely unique, they haven't just reused the same mould, so this is brand new, and it's nicely presented. Once again, I'm not really convinced by the likeness. Out of the two figures, the Captain Kirk is definitely the stronger. This one I have a lot more issues with, because although there is a look of Patrick Stewart, it just hasn't nailed it, and I'm not sure why. Again, I think the eyes are pretty spot on. There's something else going on with this, it just doesn't look right, and yet I can't put my finger on it. Now, the articulation is pretty much the same, but there are a few differences here. So you'll notice he's got the same ball-jointed head, but he can look down and up a lot more than the Captain Kirk figure. Likewise, because of the moulding, the way the arms meet the tunic when you push the ball-jointed shoulders out there, it doesn't look horrendous the way it did in the Captain Kirk. This looks perfectly fine. Somehow the mould works well and complements the articulation in this figure. So what was a hindrance in Captain Kirk isn't so much with Captain Picard, and that's probably best exemplified by the waist. So here there's no problems with the waist swivel whatsoever. It's pretty clear what you can do with it. Again, he's got those hinge hips which look pretty terrible when you kick him out like that. And once more, he can kick his legs out forwards and backwards a fair distance as well, which is pretty decent. And of course, he's got that joint in the knee there that allows him to swivel it all the way around, and of course it bends to 90 degrees, so that's to be expected. One of the key differences here, though, is that the foot articulation doesn't work as well. So this worked really well in Captain Kirk's mould. It doesn't work with Captain Picard because that hard plastic of the trouser doesn't allow it to hinge very far. Now, Captain Picard is a lot lighter in terms of accessories. He has an extra pointing hand, which is really cool, a phaser, and his flute. I'm really pleased they gave him this extra hand because it's such a key thing that defines this character. It's a key gesture, and I like that MacFarlane Toys picked up on this little detail and added it in there because it really makes the character feel more like the character. And just like Captain Kirk, he holds his phaser absolutely perfectly. It fits very snugly into his grip there and there's no danger of it falling out, and it looks really well done. Now, his left hand is extraordinarily tight, but there is a gap there, and that's, I think, where you're supposed to put the flute because it's the only thing tight enough to hold it, but it is a bit of a struggle to get it in there, so do be careful when you're putting the flute in case it snaps because the flute does feel a bit delicate. But it is very nicely painted and it's a cool little extra to have. Although, if I'm being honest, I think I probably would have preferred something like a tricord or something cool like that. And for anyone who wants to see how he measures up against one of the Diamond Select releases, I appreciate this isn't a like for like because it's not the same costume, but pretty close in terms of the mold, because what you can see with the next generation figures from Diamond Select is they're a lot more blocky, and I'm kind of surprised at just how much taller the Diamond Select version is and how much bulkier it is than the MacFarlane. I think, again, out of the two, there's no real contest here. Obviously, the MacFarlane toy looks a lot more like Captain Picard and is a lot better, a lot more accurate and authentic, I think. So ultimately, how do I feel about these figures? Well, I think they're great, to be honest. I think they're very, very nicely produced. I think they're quite detailed for what they are, and the paint jobs are lovely. There's definitely a few issues with them. I think particularly with Captain Kirk, the mould doesn't really complement the articulations, so when you do start to push the arms out and things like that, it starts to look a bit silly, so it kind of feels like you're forced into a handful of positions to make him look good, but when he's in those positions, he looks absolutely fantastic. Picard's a lot lighter on accessories, and I think the head sculpt is quite off in my opinion. But other than that, I think it is a very nice figure, and I think they make a lovely pair. And I think it's only when you put them next to their Art Asylum or Diamond Select counterparts that you see just how much of an improvement, how much of a step up these figures actually are. And so I think it's a real shame that the line was discontinued so early and it didn't have a long life on the shelf. And as it is, it feels a little bit strange to have them in the collection because it's a hint of something that could have been, and they feel a little bit lonely really without at least having some other characters from the line to support them. So it's an odd one because I do think genuinely that this could have been an absolutely fantastic line. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.